So today's presentation is same questions, different numbers, creating dynamic questions in Edulastic. During this time, you'll learn how to use dynamic parameters to simplify the process of giving a unique math question to each student. And you'll learn how to establish the parameters, set up evaluation, and check to ensure students are seeing the dynamic questions properly. There's no one better to lead this presentation than the architect of Edulastic's math questions himself, Dr. Lawrence Chernin, Senior Director of Data Science at Edulastic. But for today's main presentation, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about dynamic parameters and the benefits and the basics on it. So dynamic parameters is a feature in Edulastic that gives each student a different parameterized version of the question, hence dynamic parameters. Many of the question types in Edulastic support these kinds of parameters, and it's also not just for math. So if you're giving questions in science or any subject that might include some numbers, you can use dynamic parameters to mix up the numbers that are going to appear. And I wanted to help you get an understanding of what that looks like visually. So you might set up a question that is blank plus blank equals blank, and Edulastic will automatically fill that in. So you have the two randomized numbers or three or multiple randomized numbers, and then it will assign it an answer, the correct answer, and it'll autograde for you. So to your class, the end result of this type of question will be something like student 1 sees 1 plus 5. The answer they need to input is 6. Student 2 sees 7 plus 9. That answer they need to input is 16, so on, so on. It's a really cool feature. So it helps you randomize numbers and questions, reduce cheating, and adds variety to practice work. And I see Harry says this can be useful for retest, definitely. So if you need to give student another test, but it needs to be very similar to the questions you're asking, this is going to be a really great feature that will save you time. So to get started with dynamic parameters, you need to make sure that in your premium teacher account, you have Power User activated. And to do that, you need to go into your profile section, and at the bottom, you'll scroll down, see a little toggle, and toggle on Power User. If you're already creating questions, authoring, using Edulastic a lot, you're going to want that on anyway. Next, you'll have to create an item, choosing an item from the bank, and then you'll choose dynamic parameters in your options. And you'll be using that @ symbol for setting up where your parameters will be placed in your items. And we'll go more into depth, but that's the high-level overview of what dynamic parameters is and the benefits that you'll see from it. And with that, I'd like to announce our featured presenter, Dr. Lawrence Chernin. Dr. Chernin began his career as an astrophysicist at Berkeley after completing a PhD at Harvard University. He has spent over 20 years of experience in technology development, and he is the product architect of the Edulastic math questions. So with that, I'm passing it off to you, Lawrence. Thank you.
Thanks, Ileana. And glad to be here and give this very informative session. And I'll pause at several places because there's a lot of information here, but we want to walk you through the different steps to create questions using dynamic parameters. But we keep in mind that everyone needs things to work quickly and right out of the box without too much digging into other things. So we've tried to make the authoring of dynamic parameter questions and all other question types as easy as possible. So it may not seem like that at first, but keep in mind that these dynamic parameters have to work in all kinds of question types. So from multiple choice questions to even passage questions and math questions, it's not restricted just to math. We've had chemistry teachers and science teachers making questions with dynamic parameters. We've had all grade levels from all the way through K through 12. So we've tried to make the interface as user-friendly as possible to handle all those different cases, different types of questions, different levels, and a lot of the complexity that might be seen on other menus. So I will touch on those other complexities later. But out of the box, we've tried to make everything work just as you'd want it without having to go into all the extra details. We could just start with the most basic example. So our most basic example here, which is the trivial case, let's just think, what is 1 plus 1? And now we would render that with this @ symbol. So the @ symbol in front of the letter, which right now you can use letters A through Z for your dynamic parameters. We don't support anything else, so it has to be A through Z. And usually I use A, B, C, D, E, F. Those kind of start out with the beginning of the alphabet. So when you see the @ symbol, that is your dynamic parameter. So if you see something like X as an expression, well, that's a variable. So if you put an @ symbol in front of the X, that becomes a dynamic parameter. So a more complicated example, we go down to the bottom. It says, what's @A plus @B equals @C? So you might wonder, well, where does this come into play? So it's particular, you would be testing the students on some kind of addition skill. So you can create an equation and you can create all kinds of other forms. And the idea is to test a particular skill. So you'd want to change how the parameters are defined so that it covers the skill that you're looking for. So here's an introductory video that I'm going to just, Ileana can play it, that will show the basics of dynamic parameters, how they look inside Edulastic. And I've started out with the very simple @ parameter. So I'm starting with the simplest possible example of testing a skill summation. So your kids, you want to know if they can add 1 to a number. And what does that equal? So I've used the parameter A and placed the @ symbol to the left. And then in the expected answer, we'll call that @B. So that's also a parameter B. So what we need to do now is define how A and B are related. There's also that green change button, but that's where kind of some of the more fancy advanced stuff is. So we're not going to go into that here. So that's something you can look at later. And then as we scroll down on the editing page, there's a section for dynamic parameters. And here's where A and B are set up, and we define what the variable type is. So now it's a number that could be anything between 0 and 100. We can also define it to be a text or a sequence of numbers or a set of numbers. So, and then the section below shows the hypothetical values of A and B, and they picked random. So there's random combinations of A and B, and there's 25 random combinations. And you can change all of those parameters. So next, we'll see how this works. The preview mode is where you should check how the dynamic parameters work and how you've set up your question. So here, A was picked as the number 43. It's a random number between 0 and 100. And the student will need to enter the correct answer, so and B. So somewhere we need to define what B is in terms of A. So that would be happening in the dynamic parameter section. Great. So that was a sort of brief introduction as to what dynamic parameters are. And I'm going to walk you through some of those steps slowly, and how do we create a question and connect our parameters. I'm going to start with a simple example, and we'll work through all the steps. And in a couple of slides, I'm going to pause and just take some questions and think about what we've seen. So I'm not going to blast through all of the stuff all at once. So let's start with a linear equation. And we want to test if students know how to do an equation that has a variable x in it. So the equation will look like something parameter x plus some number equals some other number. And we're asking the students to solve the following equation for x. So there's an equation, and it's using 3 parameters. So that's the way we set up our question. The parameters are actually typed right into the question body. So at A, at B, at C will be in the body of the question. So here I've zoomed out a little bit onto the screen. So we have in the body of the question the equation, and then as you scroll down, the expected answer field. So here in the expected answer, I actually filled in what the answer is that the students are supposed to give in terms of the parameters. So x actually equals the parameter c minus the parameter b, all divided by the parameter a. So you can define what the expected answer is in this way. So if you have math, here's where using math actually comes in handy. You need to do a little bit of math to make the dynamic parameters work. There's also other ways to do this, but this is an illustration to show how connected the parameters are, A, B, and C, between the body of the question and the expected answer field. Okay, so it's a good time to pause because I know there might be a heavy sort of abstract concept and there's more details to come. So I'm going to pause here. If you have any questions, you could put them in the chat.
There was one question that came through about where Power User is. And just so everyone knows, Power User is in your profile page. And to get there, when you're logged into Edulastic, look for your photo or initials in the lower left corner. And when you click on that to open your profile, you'll see that toggle at the bottom of your profile page.
Great. I will ask a question then. Oh, here we have a question. Yes, Harry asked a question about math. So the dynamic parameters are available in all math question types, but it's also available in other question types like multiple choice. And Edulastic has some 50 or so question types. The dynamic parameters don't work in all 50, but we're adding it into more of the question types. But the most common ones would be the math and the multiple choice or multiple select. And you can fire in parameters in those questions. And I have examples coming up with that. So I also have a question now for the audience. And so anyone can answer in the chat. When you're defining your parameter, let's say at A is your parameter, what are the values or what are the different ranges of parameters? How do you express them? So for example, or maybe I didn't pose that question well. What I meant is that the parameters at A, you can have at A, at B, all the way through at Z. There's the little choices of the letters of the alphabet. Those would be parameters. And if you don't put the at symbol in front, if you have like an X by itself, that would be just a variable in your expressions. It would be treated as part of the expression. Or you could even have words. You could have, I want to add A plus an apple equals a banana. So you can put in expressions and mix them up. Okay, so exactly as was just brought up, by default, A, B, and C will be of the number range type with its range from 0 to 100. And on the right side, it shows some randomly picked values in there that meet that criteria. So 0 to 100 probably isn't what you want. For almost every question, you're going to want to constrain that. You might want it to be a random number between -1 and 1 or something, or -5 to 5, or 10 to 20. So you can define that range, and you can configure A, B, and C with different ranges. For example, when C, which was at the denominator or the numerator, you may want that to be constrained to a different range based on the skill that you're testing for the students. Like if you put in A as a number in the millions, that may be much too advanced. So you'd want to constrain the ranges here. Or you could put in a set of numbers. So you could explicitly say that A should be picked from these following numbers, which are separated by commas. And I'll show some examples of how to define ranges of numbers, sets of numbers. You can also define these parameters to be a sequence. So sequence is a more advanced thing. A sequence associates numbers with each other. So you might want to pair certain values of A, B, and C. Like let's say A is equal to 2. And when A is equal to 2, you also want B equal to 2 and C equal to 2. You want to constrain them. Or when A is 2, you want B to equal 3 and C equals 5. So the sequence parameter, or the variable type of sequence, constrains the relationships between the parameters. They would be in the same order. So they're comma separated. And I might show an example of that if we get to it later. But For most uses, you may not need to use the sequences. Oh, here we go. So here's a set, and A is going to be chosen now from the numbers from 2 to 4, 2, 4, or 6. What a set means is that when the combinations are formed, it can pick anything from A. So A could be equal to 6, B could be equal to 2, and C could equal 3. That would be a valid combination. On the other hand, if you wanted numbers of A or A to be equal to 2, and then C to be 2, and C to be 3, and B equal to 2, then you need to use the sequence variable type. That's what I was mentioning. The sequences are relationships in the same order. All right, I'm going to pause because some questions came through. Real numbers, angle measured in radians. So that is an excellent question. So when you're talking about, say, a radian as an irrational number, so the way to do this, you can actually put in fractions of pi. So this is a pretty advanced question. I wasn't sure we would get to it here, but you can also put in your number set as, say, pi over 2. You can start typing in LaTeX type expressions. So all of that's possible. I wasn't planning on covering that. There's Help Center articles on that. You can also have fractional numbers like 1.5. You could have your sequences 1.5, 1.6, 1.7. And you can control here with whether your numbers are integers or real numbers with that button I showed before. There's an options control button on a previous slide. We'll come to that later. These are kind of the settings to control the way the answer works. I just first wanted to show how the dynamic parameters are set up. So here, this is, again, just showing the same thing where the number of combinations by default is 25. In the bottom here, I show create 10. You can change that number. So there will be 10 different combinations, and you can get up to 200 different combinations. And it might take longer to generate when you ask for that large number. So usually, a small number is going to work more easily. And that's what I wanted to show on this slide. So check your combinations. So here is an example where you set some values for A, B, and C to be picked. And when you scroll down on the page, you can generate, there's also a blue button to generate numbers if you change the parameters, the ranges, or the variable type. So you can examine the pairings and see if these are what you like. You may want to delete one of these pairings, which means that they won't show up when the students are taking them. So I will show that later. There's a delete button on the right side. So very important here is the preview mode. So the preview mode is next on the top, next to the edit mode. The edit mode, you create your question. And then in preview, you would go in and see how one view of the question looks for a student. So a preview will pick one pairing of the parameters. Here, for example, it picked the first parameter 2, the second one 6, the third 5. That's one combination. And yeah, this is the preview mode. So I typed in -0.5. I clicked on the blue check answer button, and it marked it as correct. It's always good to check an incorrect answer as well. So if you typed in -1/3 and clicked the check answer button, see that grades is incorrect it'll show as red. So right now, this will only preview with one combination. Later, we're going to add an option here that lets you preview with different combinations to see how it looks. So always important to preview how the questions work. So I did this question with 3 parameters, A and B and C. And before I showed the expected answer was actually solving the equation for X. But you could also do it like this. I find actually this is a little bit easier to see in this way. So I'm going to make a new parameter D. That's the expected answer. And I'm going to use the other parts of the edit page to define what D is in terms of A, B, and C. And there's that green button, the change button. So for example, if you do want to define the answer to be an integer or rounded to 1 decimal place or in radians or things like that, that's where you open that up and look at all the variety of options. Tons of stuff in there. I'm not really going to cover it now. We could talk about that maybe in the end of the webinar. So here is the important setting of the parameter D. So A, B, and C are chosen as number set. In fact, for C, I only gave one choice. And now D will contain the formula that connects A, B, and C. So I entered it again here. And this time you don't put the parameter sign, the @ symbol in front of A, B, and C in the expression for D. There, if you can mouse, or I moused over it. So yeah, the advantage of having it this way is you can see in the table below, we can review and see that it makes sense. So the first combination, A is equal to 6, B 2, and C 10. And then the answer D would be 4/3. So you can scan the table and kind of look and say, well, I like these combinations, or I don't like one. So you might want to remove one. There's an option to remove a combination, or you might want to go back and change the way A, B, and C are defined. The values, the 2, 4, 6, or the 10, change those. And there's a blue button that will allow the parameter ranges to change. It may also just do them automatically in the table below, but otherwise click on the blue generate button. So here's a multiple choice question. So this is not just about math. So here is multiple choice. We're asking what is A plus B, and the students will see something like what is 2 plus 5, and the answer is a multiple choice. So I've defined these other parameters at C, at D, at E, and at F. Those will be the multiple choice options. So as A is marked here, that would be the correct answer. So when we define how the parameters are connected, we'll say that C equals A plus B, D, E, and F equals something else. So that's how multiple choice questions are in terms of parameters. And the other question types as well can have parameters in them. So here's how the A, B, C, and now D, E, and F are. So C was the correct answer, but I made other answers, distractors or incorrect answers for D, E, and F. So let's say D, that's the wrong answer. So it's actually A plus B plus 1. And so here's how you can create a multiple choice question. And you may want to create other questions using similar techniques. And here's in the preview mode of that particular question. So it picked A and B as 2 and 6. And you can see A is correctly 8. The student checked answer by clicking on B, so it marked it as incorrect. So that's how to preview and check that your questions are working. And keep in mind, it will just show one combination here in preview mode. I'm not sure which one it picks. It may be the first one in the table. So here we go. Here's how this becomes complicated super quickly. And here's a complicated equation. And there's like 6 boxes to fill in. So, you can really go crazy with these questions and make all kinds of complicated dynamic parameter questions where there are multiple formulas and the formulas are connected to each other. So this is how I've seen very advanced math questions created. Also, I've seen it used for science labs, chemistry labs. You might have concentrations of different elements and a table where students have to fill in different fields in the table. You can have like 10 fields all connected to each other. So all of this is possible with dynamic parameters. So here we go. I've kind of given you a high-level view of what's possible. And the questions that I showed in the previous slide are actually available in Edulastic, and there's this link. And these are the examples. So if you want to poke around, you can clone the questions and edit them yourself. And it starts out with the examples that I've shown so far, and then there's more sophisticated examples towards the end. There was a question about, is this appropriate for elementary and middle school? Yes, absolutely. And you can also control, there's a question about repeating numbers. Oh, great. Yeah. Here's an example of how this test looks. So there's 7 questions. The first one is the linear equation with x. And then there's this other question with a plus b. And next, and here's a more complicated example with a circle, where the students need to identify the radius and the circumference. And so you would use formulas and define what they are in terms of the parameters. And next, and here's the more complicated example of a circle. And now this webinar was supposed to introduce other topics in math. So we have these graphing questions, and you can do things like ask students to graph an equation by plotting points and then connecting them. So in this example test, I've included a question about that to show this exponential function. And you can play around with that question. And then next is another graphing. And look, there's radians on the x-axis. So a lot of places in our math questions, it understands LaTeX. So you can type in actually pi or /pi. And also in graphing, you can use pi, and you can do expressions in radians. Throughout the math, you can switch between degrees and radians. I think we've configured now for it to understand the degrees by default. So in the change button, the green button, you can configure what the degrees unit should be. So there's all those kind of things available. And the next question, all the way through AP Calculus. So the math evaluator, which evaluates the students' responses, understands how to evaluate graphing. It understands dynamic parameters. It understands fractions, and it can also do calculus by understanding equivalent forms of expressions that are pretty advanced. So one box handles all of this stuff, that entry box. And so this is what we've designed to try to make it as easy as possible without going into the change button. Most of the questions will hopefully work as you want, but that green change button, maybe you can click on one of the questions, the first one. So go to the edit. Oh, it's not available for edit. That's okay. I'll come to that later.
Yeah, you'll need to clone it to
edit it. Exactly. Don't worry about that. Let me come to some of those things because there's a lot of options there, and I'll show that later. The green change button. Here we go. So the one box, the expected answer box, does all kinds of stuff. And here, for example, what if your question answers 12 miles? It actually understands that miles is a unit, and it understands other units, centimeters per second, or all kinds of things. It understands X could be a variable, or X could be a parameter if you put an at in front of it, or if you wrote something as an S, is S a variable or is it seconds? So by default, all of these things should work. But because you go into the preview mode and check your question, you may want to configure it differently. So there are modes, there's mathematical equivalence, and here are all kinds of options to configure it. And there's that little I button, the gray I button above, each option that kind of explains also on the right side what these different options do. And we're always happy to help explain. If you have any questions, you can contact the support. If you need assistance, there's also the help center and videos on that. So I didn't want to cover it, but I just wanted to show you that there are all these ways to control your question in terms of being an integer, or a simple fraction or other kinds of fractions, or tell it how to round the answer. There's also another mode. There's a literal mode. And a literal mode means don't think about mathematical equivalence. The answer should be exactly as you specify it. In mathematical equivalence mode, for example, it also understands relationships between feet and miles. So you may not want that in your units. That's where a literal mode can come in handy. So here's graphing, because I mentioned some advanced topics. I showed this in the test, so students should graph something. And here is an exponent function, or exponential, sometimes it could also be referred to, and the students can connect the points. Point B, the student entered incorrectly, so it's showing in red. And this question is also set up for partial credit. So the student would get 2/3 on this question. And the students are asked to enter 3 points. You can change that and ask them to enter 4 points, and you can change the equation. All of this is explained. You can poke around in the example test with this question. So these are the graphing objects on the right side, and we're adding a lot more. And graphing covers all kinds of things, from just points and polygons all the way through trigonometry functions and conic sections. There's all kinds of other stuff available. These are some of the things we're looking at now. Piecewise functions for your high school math, polar graphing, and as I mentioned, for calculus, we can ask students to solve problems like this, and we're adding more options to handle that. So all of these things are there or partially there, and we're adding more to it. Yes, you can also control the calculator, as Harry asked. You can let students use the calculator independently, or you can block it when they're taking tests. So I won't cover that too much. But for example, if you go to the Help Center, as shown here, and search for something like graphing, there are various articles on making questions about a parabola and other kinds of advanced functions in the graphing. And you could start with the basic articles, like just graphing advanced options. And I think it will start from the beginning with a bit more basic graphing and working its way up.
All right. And now we are at the Ask Lawrence a Question portion of the event. So if you have a question about that you want worked through on Edulastic, or just a general question about math questions, let us know.
Yeah, so great. Thanks, everyone. And complex numbers, certainly. And also, I will take a request to create a question now. If you have something you would like me to ask or compose, I will compose a question. So we can handle complex numbers. Yes, you should be careful with I, because I may be interpreted as a complex number. It may not. We've tried to design the system to understand the context. So when you type something in with an I, hopefully it works correctly and understands what your intention is. It may not, and that's why you should use the preview mode. And you may need to configure some of those options under the green button to force it to understand that you have a complex number. Factoring trinomials. Do you want to post the trinomial here in the chat? Okay.
Here we go.
Yeah, great. So the answer, I can already tell you, is yes. It's been a while since I did this, so I may have to fumble around a bit, but certainly factoring, there's all kinds of capabilities to handle factoring, and there's a factor option. But let's see what specifically you have in mind. Okay, great. Yes, this is certainly possible. I'm just going to copy that, and let's see if I can copy it Okay, there. So I'm going to share my screen. We just have a few minutes left. So I might not be able to cover it all, but I'll show you where the factoring options are. So share my screen. I'm going to make a new item with a factoring. In fact, with the whole library that's available, you may want to search on factoring and see what kind of questions are available. So I will just put factor polynomial, for example, and see if it finds any existing questions. So there's all kinds of existing questions for multiple choice, and you may want it to be a math question. And let me see, there's the question type, math. And so here's one. We could write the polynomial in standard form. So there's also forms of polynomials. So let's open that. This is a library item. And so here, students have to fill in multiple boxes. And this would be like a multi-part question. And I'm going to try to create one quickly. So we're going to make a new item. It's going to be a math item. Expression is a factor. Oh, great. And here's the answer. I would first do this without dynamic parameters just to see how it looks. And our answer is this. And I want to actually put this here. Oops, let's undo that. I want to put this in math. So here's the math formatting. Let's paste that in there. So it formatted with the up arrow giving the superscript. So let's put that in here. So here's the question and here's the answer. Now, because this is set to mathematical equivalence, one has to be careful because a student may enter the unfactored answer and you don't want that. You want them to factor. So we have to open up the change button. And so here we need to use the special option factored. So I would have to check that box, but also hover over the little I. So it explains what the factored option does. So the opposite would be expanded. So we would have to check that box in mathematical equivalence mode. That would force the student to be putting in the factored form. So now let's make this with dynamic parameters. So this is more complicated now. If you did this at A, oops, we'll put them in here. Let's put it in, that'll be our C. Add B. Add A. Oops, add A. So I also put a space between the A and the X here just to make it a little bit clearer what the parameters are. So here I've defined A, B, and C. And so now we would set up D, the expected answer. Add D. So you would have to go into the dynamic parameter section and make D a formula and define, we can ignore that for now, define what the answer is in terms of the parameters A, B, and C. So this is a little tricky because there could be two answers. So you may want to constrain this problem a little bit. We could define A to be picked from sequences. Let's make A be a sequence. So the sequence will pair the numbers together. So A is 1. Let's make B 2 and C 1. This is how stuff that I can remember. So now in our expression, we have the two factors, actually they're the same. If we made C equal to 4, let's make it 6. And then this will be 5. So here's one pairing, if I remember, and we would define the formula as, but there are still two answers for this. So this one is a little bit tricky. You might do it like, you could have write the answer like, you could also do it like this, at D, put it in parentheses, and at E, So here are the two and the factored form. You can also create the question like this. So this kind of question takes a little bit more work to set up, but it's certainly possible. So because we're running out of time, I didn't want to actually finish it, but just show you the general idea.